Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. I wanted to again continue my discussion of morality that I picked up in the last couple of podcasts, leaving behind a bit the discussion of human rights and focusing more on morality itself. In the last video, I discussed how Roy Bhaskar was not a moral relativist, that instead he developed a concept of moral realism. Now, he wasn't the originator of moral realism. It's an old concept, goes back to many, many, many philosophers over the centuries. Perhaps most famously, the person that I might view as Bhaskar's adversary, Adam Smith, who argued that human nature is greed. And Bhaskar, while perhaps not disagreeing with that, would say that that is just the lower nature. There is also a higher nature, which is co-presence, which is of unity and getting along with people and actually recognizing our oneness on the deepest level of our being, that we are literally a part of one another. That's co-presence. So co-presence is much more important than the kind of reality that Smith talked about, demi-reality, which is really illusion. And that is why demi-reality to Bhaskar was essentially a translation of the Sanskrit word Maya, which is the word for illusion in Sanskrit. So that makes sense that he would have chosen that term. Now, what did Roy say about morality that might be relevant to an understanding of the current world that we are living in? For instance, the war in Gaza. Now, I will try to approach the subject of the war in Gaza from a moral perspective as opposed to a political perspective. Because when I start talking about politics, I get really, really riled up, and you wouldn't want to see. No, but when I get riled up, it has a negative effect on me as an autistic. So I don't want to do that. I want to be relatively calm, have a calm life. This is a difficult period for me because of the fact that my sister has, in effect, disowned me, and hard for me to live honestly through this part of my life. It's not the most difficult part of my life. I've had more difficult parts, but this certainly is way up there. And so I'm trying to keep myself as calm as I possibly can keep myself. Okay, so with that in mind, let me talk a bit about this concept of two natures and how it might relate both to the first world, including Israel, and the third world, including Gaza. To recap from the last podcast, the higher nature is what Roy Bhaskar called co-presence, which is the oneness of being. The fact that you and I, while separate beings, are in reality not truly separate from each other. We are really united. We are one. That may sound a bit new agey, but I don't think that's the way Roy meant it. Meaning, the whole New Age movement is basically a type of ontological idealism. And Roy was an ontological realist, not an ontological idealist. So I don't think that his approach was exactly New Agey, even though he sometimes called it that himself. I think he was wrong. I don't agree with him. I don't think his approach at all comes close to what is generally seen as the New Age movement. But again, co-presence is unity. It's oneness. It's literally co with presence, meaning being at present with others. And if we recognize that we are present with others, that I and you, while separate, are not separated, then I am less likely to want to do harm to you, and you are less likely to want to do harm to me. Because we realize that by doing harm to each other, we are actually doing harm to ourselves. And I think that is the heart of co-presence. And I mean that literally, the heart of co-presence. Because co-presence is an expression of love. I mean, if living with somebody, present with somebody, is not love, then what is love? I don't know. That is to me about the closest we can come to applying the concept of love in a sociological sense. We really can't study love. At least I don't think so. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. I'm not sure how we would study love sociologically, but we can study co-presence. We can study the degree to which people are close to one another. There are indices which can measure that kind of thing. For example, there's one famous index which asks people, how would you feel about living in the same community as person X, meaning someone of a different race? Person says, that's okay. Then you go on to the second part. Okay, how would you feel about living in the same neighborhood as person X? Person thinks for a second and says, yeah, that's okay. I wouldn't mind that. Okay. How would you feel about living next door to person X? The person thinks even more intently and says, I guess that would be okay too. Okay. Finally, how would you feel if person X married your son or married your daughter? At that point, the person says no. Then you, based upon that, that can give you some good insights into the degree of co-presence which exists in a particular community. In other words, you do that as a part of survey research. You actually ask people in a random sample that question. And you can ask them many similar questions about people from a wide variety of different races, ethnicities, etc., and see what kinds of answers you get to those questions. And that, again, would give you an insight into how close people feel to each other, into how willing people are to live side by side or even in the same family ultimately with somebody who is outwardly different from themselves. So it can be a very useful device. So that's a concrete example of applying the concept of co-presence sociologically. Now, that particular index is an old index. It developed way before Roy Baskar's critical realism and meta reality, so it has no relationship directly to Roy Baskar. But I think it could be applied to critical realism and meta reality very easily and used as a way of measuring it, as a way of measuring the degree of co-presence which exists or might not exist in a particular community, and therefore it can tell people who are maybe are people who are on a consulting firm, people who are members of a city council, people who are on a school board, whatever, what types of improvements might be good that would change the outlook of people who live in that community. Ultimately, everything begins with the education of children. So I don't think this is any exception. You would start with children. You would start out by trying to understand how do children understand each other and themselves, and then go on from there. So in other words, you would start out by asking those kinds of questions in relationship to children, and maybe even ask children themselves how they would feel about it, and see what kinds of responses you get, and then begin to educate children, perhaps in a way, and maybe this is controversial, that contradicts the upbringing of that child in her or his own family. Some people don't like that. There are a lot of people, and they are mostly on the right, who don't like the idea of schools teaching things which they see as contrary to their own rearing of their children. For example, the most common example, which is not really relevant to the subject, but it makes the point, is the whole issue of evolution. People who want to see creationism or intelligent design, which is really just a version of creationism developed by the Discovery Institute, taught alongside of evolution. Their argument would be, well, if you want to teach evolution, then why not teach all the other options? Well, that's like saying, okay, if you want to teach that the earth is round, or I guess more oblong, I'm not really sure, I'm not a geologist, then shouldn't you also teach that the earth might be flat? And I think most people would agree. Not everyone. There are some flat earthers out there, but I think most people would agree. No, I don't want my kids being taught that the earth is flat. And yet, when it comes to the issue of creationism or intelligent design, approximately half of all Americans believe in one of those things. Half. Half of all Americans believe in utter nonsense. And so I think that if that is true, if we recognize that that kind of gross misunderstanding exists among the general American public, then similar gross misunderstanding exists with respect to race, gender, class, ethnicity, and so forth. And those things can, and I would argue, should be taught as well. So people's conceptions of those things can change, can improve. And so literally, schools are doing what they should do, which is to improve people, to change their character, and above all, to make them better citizens. That used to be called civics. We've stopped teaching civics. Not sure exactly why, but we have stopped teaching it for the most part. Maybe in some ways that's good, because the way civics was taught was commonly through a very right-wing lens. So I wouldn't want to see civics taught in that way, but certainly some type of civics, which is basically learning to become a good citizen, should be taught. And I think what should be taught is a civics of responsibility, a civics of love, a civics of tolerance, and a civics um, of of getting along with people better than we are right now. Long way of saying it. Okay, so um, that's kind of the, the idea of co-presence, right? So co-presence, then demi-reality being the opposite of that, being in a sense the absence of co-presence. And what we see in the world around us is pretty much the absence. We don't see much co-presence, not much. Some, but not much. What we see more of is the absence of co-presence, Maya, illusion. And that's the negation or the absence of co-presence. And the only way to absent that absence is through co-presence itself. And ultimately, when we absent the absence of demi-reality through co-presence, I'll get it right, we end up with emancipation. And ultimately, that's really what we want. So, what is emancipation? And how does emancipation relate to the current situation, say, I don't know, in Gaza? Well, certainly the Gazans right now are not being emancipated by Israel. I think that can be fairly definitively stated. Israel is not emancipating the Gazans. Israel is behaving very much on a plane of demi-reality, very much on a plane of selfishness, on illusion, on self-centeredness. That has been the framework that Israel has been operating on, arguably since Israel started, or even before Israel started, when they began coming in with tanks and mowing down entire Palestinian neighborhoods, and then claiming that they were building on a desert, of all things. But who created the desert? It was the Israelis or the pre-Israelis. They are the ones who created the desert, and they built new buildings upon it. So yeah, that's an easy thing to say. Once you've destroyed a place, you can say, let's build. Well, it's easy to say let's build once you have already razed existing structures to the ground. So right now, there is almost no quality of life at all in Gaza. In North Gaza, there's virtually no place to live. There are no hospitals. There are no universities. It's basically it's basically a desert land. It is a desert land created by the Israeli government. And now South Gaza is rapidly following in North Gaza's footsteps and is rapidly being turned by the Israeli government into another desert land. So, what are we to do? I guess the answer is there really is nothing that we can do. We can recognize it. And I think that the best recognition that we can have of what is happening now in Gaza is that it reflects the broader deterioration of the First World. That the First World, also called the Empire or the American Empire, is rapidly being torn to the ground. It is being destroyed not by some outside force. Nobody is coming in from the outside to destroy the First World. The First World is literally destroying itself. And if there is no First World, in a week, a month, a year, a decade, whatever, there is no one that the first world will have to blame but itself. And it's not just Israel that's doing it, because Israel could not be engaging in these acts in Gaza without the support of the United States, which they have. It is virtual heresy in the US government to challenge Zionism as a philosophy. Virtual heresy. Now, do all Jews accept Zionism? No. Do all people from Jewish background accept Zionism? Again, no. There is the Bund movement, which has recently been reborn, which is actually an anti-Zionist Jewish movement. I know the fellow who was the head of that movement. And he is currently awaiting trial. And I bet you can't guess for what. Maybe you know, but if you don't know, I doubt you will guess. He is being charged with a felony in Canada, or more specifically in Montreal, for writing graffiti. That's right. He's being charged with a felony for writing graffiti. What did he write? He wrote that we should liberate Palestine. And he wrote it on a Zionist sign. Pure sacrilege. That's what happened. And based upon pressure that the Israeli government received from this particular Zionist organization, I don't know if Canada would have done it without that pressure. Maybe, maybe not. But they did get that pressure. And based upon that pressure, they are actually charging my friend, my good friend, with a felony. It is one of the most heartbreaking events in my life. Truly heartbreaking. He is a very good man, a man who genuinely cares about the Palestinians, a Jewish man, like me, born of Jewish parents. I was born in New York City. He was born in Montreal. And yet we both see the tragedy of what is happening right now in Gaza. We communicate with each other right now on a Facebook chat system. And we have communicated in other ways before. And I can't tell you the amount of pain that I feel when I think about it for him and for the people that love him. To have to go through this travesty of seeing their friend tried for a felony for writing graffiti on a Zionist sign. Who ever heard of such a thing? I mean, a civil charge brought by the owner of the sign? I think that would be silly, but at least that would not be totally out of bounds. If I own something and you deface it, I have a right to bring civil charges against you. Why does the Canadian government have authority to charge this guy with a felony for writing Free Palestine on a Zionist sign? If it makes no sense to you, you are not alone. If it does make sense to you, with all due respect, I feel sorry for you. I feel sorry for you. because it should not make sense to you. It should not make sense to any person with a conscience at all. No one should condone the right of a country to bring a felony charge against a citizen for graffiti. Graffiti is not a major crime. In fact, in general, as far as I know, it's not a crime at all. Or if anything, maybe it's a misdemeanor if you write graffiti on a public tunnel or highway or subway or something. Maybe, I don't know. But a felony for writing graffiti? Graffiti of liberation, of emancipation. Makes no sense. And yet that is the world in which we are living right now. That is our world. And I think we need to be aware of it, to contend with it, not to shut our eyes. That's the worst thing we could possibly do, is to shut our eyes and make believe it's not happening. Because that gives evil permission to flourish. If we don't speak out and condemn evil, no matter where that evil is coming from, then are we even human beings? I would say no. I would say no. I realize that's a controversial statement. I realize that. We are Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens sapiens. But to me, as I've said before, being a human being is an attainment. It's not something that we are born with. We have to acquire humanity, which is the noun, another noun form of being a human being. To me, humanity and human being refer to the same thing. And if we have no humanity at all, then we are not human beings. This has been Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.